shown us the typology there is that Melchizedek wasn't born into becoming a high priest, but he became a high priest because God designated him as such. And so that likeness applies to the Son. He doesn't become a priest because of his birth, and the writer went on to talk about he's from the tribe of Judah. Law says nothing about a priest from the tribe of Judah. So the law had nothing to do with Christ becoming high priest. Instead, it was a promise of God. And in fact, that promise is recorded in Psalm 110. So that's why I'm talking about this seismic shift here. Psalm 110, this very short psalm near the end of the book of Psalms, is so very vitally important in understanding God's design for his relationship between him and his people through a high priest. And it was a special high priest who was different than Aaron, but he was going to be like Melchizedek. And so that's a significant point we need to understand here when we're looking at this section that is covered here in Hebrews chapter 7, is to understand this idea of the difference in the nature of the high priest. Now, if you drop on down to verse 12, when the priesthood is changed, of necessity there takes place a change of law also. The reason why I think this point is so very important for us to understand, even today, I really cannot tell you how many times I've heard members of churches that I've been associated with say something similar to this. Well, the New Testament just replaces the Old Testament. The new law just takes the place of the old law. The law of Christ takes the place of the law of Moses. But there's still 9 of the 10 commandments that are in fact repeated in the new law. So really the only thing that's changed is we've changed from Saturday to Sunday. I can't tell you how many times I've heard that. The writer of Hebrews was saying, no, you're not paying attention. You're not listening to what I'm telling you. When we talk about changing the priesthood, changing the law, it doesn't mean going from Aaron to Eleazar. It doesn't mean we've just taken one and replaced it with one that's almost the same thing. If we think that's how we get to God today, you need to reread the book of Hebrews. The writer of Hebrews is trying to get us to understand it's not the same, just a different name, a different cover. This is something that is dramatically different. That's ultimately what we have to understand about this deeper message that the writer of Hebrews is talking about. We need to go beyond the elementary teachings. We need to go beyond the elementary principles. We need to realize that the change in the priesthood to a different kind of high priest necessarily requires that we have a different kind of law. It's not just simply replacing Saturday with Sunday. It's not just simply replacing these elements that we follow to be saved with these elements that we follow to be saved. Anybody with any thoughts or comments?
Eddie,
yes, go ahead.
I just love that. That's it. I never thought of it through that lens.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, especially maybe the church culture I grew up in. Not only was that a big point topic, but to our detriment because we neglected a lot of the Old Testament and saw it as very like split entities in a way that was not good,
Right.
For our own benefit. And I just love the way that you phrase that, and just a great new perspective on how they work together and are separate, but I don't know, just really like it.
I appreciate that too, and I can tell you the times when we did study the Old Testament was often just to emphasize how much it's like the New Testament. And we have to understand that the Old Testament is designed to show us that system will not work with us. The book of Galatians said it's our schoolmaster to bring us to Christ, meaning that it shows us we need Christ. We need something different. And we're going to get into that either late in our class today or next week to emphasize that point. Anybody else with any thoughts? David, please. Sure. Yes.
Why don't we know more about that process? If he was that active with the king of Salem at that time, when Abram was in the process of starting the grand plan, why don't we know more about it? And then this verse 12 comes along and tells us why we don't know more about it. It's not that important.
Right. And that's really a very good question. And as I mentioned, I think last week, that doesn't mean that there weren't people who were curious. There is a wealth of literature in the Qumranic literature, kind of the intertestamental period between the end of the Old Testament and up to the time of Christ, and even beyond that, where the Jews were speculating about who is this Melchizedek, because they recognized that writing in Psalm 110 is very seminal. So we got to know more about him, and so they really kind of invented stories about him. But you're right, it is very curious how he suddenly just appears and then disappears. And I think that's part of the idea. The writer, had talked about the fact, without father, without mother, without genealogy, abides a priest forever. He is designed by God intentionally to just appear and then disappear with no predecessor, no successor. He abides a priest forever. And I think probably a second thing is, why don't we have any of the extant writings where, let's say, John actually wrote his gospel? Why don't we have a copy of that? Well, we know what would happen. People would worship the papyrus it was written on instead of the message that it contains. And I think that probably would have something to do with it. If we knew more about Melchizedek, we would worship Melchizedek instead of the one that he is a shadow of. But excellent question. Anybody else with any other thoughts up to this point?
Well, I think what the writer in verse 11, he says, now in perfection is through the Levitical priesthood.
Mm-hmm.
He's trying to bring us to perfection. Then down in verse 19, he says, for the law made nothing perfect.
Right.
The priesthood of law can make nothing perfect. Now, on the other hand, there is a bringing in of a better hope through which we draw near to God. Drawing near to God is what perfection is, and that's going to be in Christ.
Exactly. And again, that cannot happen through law. And that's the point that the writer of Hebrews is trying to get us to see. And he's going to look at it from different aspects to show us law is not the answer. What law does, in fact, is it pushes us away from God. But Christ is the one who brings us closer to God. And I think here we go. Law can make nothing perfect. Law cannot make me perfect. And so if law can't do it, then I need something else. I need something different, not the same. Go ahead, Dean.
Marvelous perfection through the Levitical priesthood. The sacrifices that they offered did not make one perfect.
Exactly. They could not. And the writer's going to say that later on. So the blood of bulls and goats cannot take away sin. Never could. It was just simply an image, a typology of the real sacrifice that would come later. All right, let's drop down towards where we actually left off last week, the end of chapter 7. Notice verse 22. Here's another one of those things where if this was a movie with sound effects, you would hear rumbling in the background. This would be one of those things to just say, whoa, wait a minute, what did you just do here? In verse 22, it says, so much the more also Jesus. First of all, the name Jesus is very rarely used in the book of Hebrews. The most common term that we find is either Christ or Son. There's a few times in chapter 2 once, chapter 3 once. Here, I think there was maybe 2 others that I found where the name Jesus is identified. It seems to be that the writer wanted to make special emphasis when he does use the name Jesus. And so he does specify here that Jesus has become, as we said, the guarantee of a better covenant. That word has not been used before up to this point. What is a covenant? That's what this is where we kind of need to stop and say, wait a minute, what are we talking about now? We've been talking about law before. We've talked about sacrifices. But now we find where the writer introduces the idea that we have a better covenant. Obviously, that suggests there was a previous covenant. What was the previous covenant? This is something that I don't remember the exact day, but I remember when this first struck me, that there is a difference between covenant and law. The previous covenant is not the law of Moses. The previous covenant is the 10 Commandments. That's why those commandments were written on tablets of stone. Those tablets of stone were maintained within the Ark of the Covenant. In the book of 2 Corinthians, and we'll probably take a look at this in just a moment, it'll talk about the covenant that was contained on tablets of stone. That was the covenant that God made with the people of Israel. And of course, what happened? Let's look at this. Exodus 34. I remember when David was doing a lesson from this, and I don't know, this may have been in September. I think it was because I actually wrote it down on my bulletin for that day. But David was talking about this, and of course I knew I was going to be teaching Hebrews at that point. And that just hit me. So, I need to make sure we talk about this when we get to Hebrews chapter 7 and 8. So that's what we're going to do today. Exodus chapter 34. I'm sorry, chapter 32. I was wondering, where is it? Chapter 32. Remember, Moses was up on the mountain. God was writing the covenant on these tablets of stone. What were the people of Israel doing? Yeah, they were worshiping a calf. So, you shall not make graven images. God's writing that up on a tablet of stone up on the mountain. How did they know? Do you remember what happened before Moses went up on the mountain? God spoke those 10 Commandments to them. They all heard them. And that was the covenant. So while Moses is going up there to get the covenant in written form, they're already breaking the covenant. Moses comes back down from the mountain. Notice here, Exodus chapter 32. Verse 25. Now when Moses saw the people were out of control, for Aaron had let them get out of control to be a derision among their enemies, Moses stood in the gate of the camp and said, "Whoever is for the Lord, come to me." And all the sons of Levi gathered together to him. Notice here 27 and 28. He said to them, "Thus saith the Lord, the God of Israel, every man of you put his sword on his thigh, go back and forth from gate to gate in the camp, kill every man his brother, every man his friend, every man his neighbor." So the sons of Levi did as Moses instructed, and about 3,000 of the people fell that day. Two things about that just felt like a ton of bricks falling on my head. The very first thing we find recorded when they get the covenant from God about how they are to live, the very first thing that's recorded is them breaking that covenant, and the result of that is they're out of control and 3,000 people die. Acts chapter 2, what happens there? We don't have to go and read it, we all know it. What did the people receive from God in Acts chapter 2? The Spirit is poured out. But in the language we're talking about, a covenant. They received the covenant that is based in Christ. The different covenant. And what's the result that we read beginning in verse 41 of chapter 2 through the end of that chapter? 3,000 are saved. Was that just a coincidence that about 3,000 people died in Exodus 27 or 32 and about 3,000 people are saved here? I doubt it. But I'll get you in just a minute, Ted. The other thing is, what do we find beginning in verse 42 through 47? The people are living together in harmony. They are sharing their meals together. They're together with gladness with one another. They're not out of control. In fact, this is the lion laying down with the lamb. This is the little child who plays with the lion. This is the peace that Jesus came to bring. What's different? Different is the nature of the covenant. One's a covenant based on law. One is a covenant based on the blood of Christ. Go ahead, Ted.
I suppose, I don't know at all, you haven't answered that much here, but it's never been clear to me why there is any difference or why certain things are a covenant or a law or commandment more than me just saying, this is what I would do.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like people today, I don't use this expression, I'm sorry, but to be honest with you, like when they say that,
Mm-hmm.
I just think it's terrible because it makes it sound like everything else you say is not honest.
Right.
So, even in, is it God recognizing us and giving into us and making sometimes a covenant or establishing a law or just says, this is what you do? Why in the world would God, unless it's because of us, the way we look at it, like, I tell you I'm going to do something, I'll do it. If there's a contract, like something that you can sue me, I'd probably work harder. You know,
Right.
But that's a terrible thing about me. It shouldn't be. It should be that if I say I'm going to do it, whether it's a commandment, a covenant, a law, a contract, I should be just as bound to it. But why does God at certain times, I don't know if you have an answer, but is it just because of mankind? Certain things are more serious than others and all that, but like the most minuscule thing we say we're going to do to God versus the most serious thing that we're going to do. Same thing from God, the most simple thing or the most serious thing. Why is there such a significance sometimes and a covenant established and a decree written on tablets versus just it's the way it is?
Let me see if I can address part of that. Obviously, I don't have all those answers. But I would suggest that one of the things that distinguishes a covenant was the fact that it required certain actions, and there would be consequences that would come about because of those actions. So essentially what God was saying to the people of Israel was, you keep my covenant, I will be your God forever. I will bless you, I will keep you, I will protect you, I will give you life. So it was imposed on the people of Israel, you do this, and this is what I will do in response to that. Whereas opposed to a law just simply says, you do this.
But even in a law, there's inflection or there's supposition that if you don't do this, this is going to happen.
And law would what's the word I want to use for it?
If I break one of those laws, there's results.
The law would fill in the details of the covenant. Does that make sense? The law was kind of like the fine print to the covenant. Somebody else with thoughts, ideas? Go ahead.
I've always heard the covenant ceremony, if you will, in Exodus is likened to a marriage ceremony.
Yes.
That God and Israel are coming together in a type of marriage ceremony.
Yes.
Now, if you kind of put that in terms of how we do things today, and I don't know if this answers the question at all, or helps at all, but when we do have a marriage ceremony, you know, it's understood at the end we're going to be married. We could just go up there and somebody could just pronounce us married,
Right.
and that's it. But we make vows, and
Yeah.
you know, we don't outline all the stipulations of, well, if this doesn't happen, then this is going to happen, and all of those types of things. Those things are either understood or developed as the relationship continues. But it is still verbalized, and then, you know, to be consummated. But I've always just thought of it in those
Yeah.
terms. And so to me, that's kind of what distinguishes a covenant from a law. A covenant is not just the initiation of it, but the institution of it.
Right.
And the law is kind of fleshing it out in terms of, you know, what's going to happen, what's not going to happen, what the consequences might be, what the benefits might be, and all those types of things.
Yeah, I think that is helpful. So let's put it back into the context here of Hebrews 7. Jesus becomes the guarantee. So here is another aspect of what makes a covenant a covenant. There is a promise, a guarantee on the part of the one. Now, sometimes covenants were two-way covenants where there were equal partners, but covenants from God were always one way. God says, you do this, and this is what I will do in response. Jesus becomes the guarantee from God when he is making a better covenant with the people of Israel. So he had made a covenant with the people of Israel in the days of Moses, put on tablets of stone. Let's go to 2 Corinthians now. 2 Corinthians, I think it's chapter 3. I forgot to write down the chapter number. Yeah, 2 Corinthians chapter 3, and I'm going to start in verse 5. Not that we are adequate in ourselves to consider anything as coming from ourselves, but our adequacy is from God. Paul here starts by just simply saying, this is not me, this is God. Verse 6, who also made us adequate as servants of a new covenant. And again, I don't think it's translated from that same word hetero, but it very much is that idea. This is a new and different covenant. He has made us servants of the new covenant, not of the letter. It's not a covenant based on letter. It's a covenant based on the Spirit. For the letter kills. So those 10 commandments written in stone, when Moses brings them back to the people of Israel, what does it mean to them? Ultimately, it means their death. It's kind of shocking to think about. But those tablets of stone ultimately meant to the people of Israel, this is your death. But what does Christ bring us? Christ brings us the Spirit. And what does that mean? It means life. Now, that's not the picture we normally think of. We think of Moses coming down from Mount Sinai. Oh, yes, the people are doing what they're doing, and it's wrong, and Moses becomes angry and throws the tablets down and breaks them. But ultimately, Moses is bringing down their death sentence. And Christ, when he dies on the cross, is giving us life. The irony of all of that is just incredible. He goes on to say in verse 7, but if the ministry of death in the letters engraved on stones came with glory. Okay, again, this is the picture we think of Mount Sinai. Moses up in the mountain, he's seeing the glory of God. His face is shining like the sun. But again, that's a ministry of death. Those tablets of stone was their death sentence. So how much more glory should we view our Christ, who died on the cross and was resurrected from that tomb? How much more glory should we give to that? There's no comparison. That's the images that we need to see. That's what the writer of Hebrews is trying to get us to see. This is not just simply the New Testament replacing the Old Testament. This is not just changing from Saturday to Sunday and now everything's so much better. This is a completely different covenant. It works in a completely different way. Because the old way, as we're going to see when we get in chapter 8, didn't work. It never did work. It never will work. So the writer says, since Jesus did not become priest according to lineage, he had to become priest in a different way. And of course, that's the point of Melchizedek. That just like Melchizedek, he abides a priest forever. It wasn't because he replaced somebody else, and certainly nobody ever replaces him. So what does that mean? It means that he is still interceding. He is still my high priest right now, today, this very moment. And if you are in Christ, he is your high priest right now, standing at the right hand of God, and he is speaking for you to God right now. I don't know how that makes you feel, but I know how it makes me feel. There's no better feeling than that. To know that the Son of God is right there at the throne of God right now, speaking to God on my behalf. That's what Stephen saw right before he died. He died in peace. Well, sure, physically it was violent. I can't imagine what it would be like to have people throwing stones at you to the point you die. But Stephen was in peace. He died with a smile on his face. Because he knew Jesus was right there interceding, speaking to the Father on his behalf. That's the covenant that I want to be a part of. That's a whole lot different than Aaron going into a tent carrying blood from my lamb. Instead, I've got the Lamb of God who has carried his blood. We'll talk about that when we get to chapter 9. So we see here in verse 26, it's fitting. Wait a minute, that's familiar. Go back to chapter 2 if you would. Chapter 2 and verse 10. Somebody read that, please. All right, so we saw here almost at the beginning of the book, the writer says it is fitting, it is appropriate for Jesus to go through these things, to be perfected, to be made complete. Now we come to chapter 7, and the writer is saying again, it is fitting. Have we not made any progress at all? Is the writer just circling back on himself and hasn't made any progress at all? Well, surely we don't feel that way. No, what the writer is doing is showing us the fulfillment of what he had said back then, why it was so fitting, why God's plan is so appropriate. I always question when we get to the, why does God do something? Do I have the right to ask that question? On one level, no. Isaiah 55 makes it clear. I can't think like God thinks. His ways, his thoughts are so much higher than mine, it's beyond my imagination to even think about why God chooses what he does. But yet at the same time, when God does reveal something, including why he does something, then that's absolutely something for me to learn. Because it's going to help my faith. It's going to help me appreciate God. And I think that's what the writer of Hebrews has done. Chapter 2 and verse 10, he says, it's fitting, it's appropriate that he is perfected by going through these sufferings. Now he's come back to that same thought, and he's shown us why it's appropriate. And specifically, it is so that we see it's fitting that we have a high priest like this, who is, look at these list of terms. He is holy. I'll never forget the classes that Adam taught from the book of Leviticus. And the emphasis there upon the holiness of God. Everything about the laws that the people of Israel had was to remind them how holy their God was and how he called them to holiness. Now, again, they couldn't get there through the law. But that still was the purpose of the law, was to remind them how holy God is and how he called them to be holy. Innocent, the one who does not ever deserve to die, is the only one who is qualified to die to help others. Undefiled, he has no flaws. He is separated from sinners. That's an interesting thought, because remember the criticism of the Pharisees? Well, he eats with sinners. Yes, physically he was with them. He had come to them to save them, but yet he still remained separated from them and exalted above the heavens. It's fitting that we have that high priest. Goes on in verse 27, he does not need daily like those high priests to offer up sacrifices. We don't have time, but just if you go back and look at the Old Testament and you look at just the references to the sacrifices, it was dangerous to be an animal in Israel, specifically a lamb. You didn't have a long lifespan if you were an animal in Israel. There was this constant sacrifice of animals every single day, sometimes hundreds or thousands of animals that were put to death. And why? Because the people who cared for them sinned. And so those animals kept dying. Here, our high priest doesn't have to offer those sacrifices daily. He doesn't have to do them because of his own sins, and he doesn't have to continue to do it for the sins of the people that he is serving. Notice it says, because he did this once for all when he offered up himself. So my sins are covered by one sacrifice. Verse 28, it concludes by saying the law appoints men as high priests who are weak, but the word of the oath, which came after the law, appoints a son made perfect forever. The oath comes after the son. Now, normally when I think of the promise of God, I go back to Abraham, Genesis 12. And there's clear evidence that that is a very important promise that God made. But here, the writer of Hebrews specifies that the oath he's talking about came after the law. So what is it? Give you a hint. I've already mentioned it several times in our class this morning. Psalm 110. You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. That is the oath of God. It's the only place in the Bible, or only place in the Old Testament it's recorded. But God made an oath in that psalm that he was designating his son to be a high priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. That came after the law. And so what the writer of Hebrews is telling us, it supersedes the high priest of the law. Here's a promise of God, I'm going to designate my son. It's very similar to what we find with Saul and David. Remember, Saul was the first king of Israel. He was an anointed king. David had many opportunities to kill Saul, refused to do so every time, saying, he is the Lord's anointed. I can do nothing against him. And every time David said that, he knew that God had already anointed him to become king, which superseded the anointment of Saul. And so when God did that, God had determined, Saul is not my king. David is my king. Here we find a covenant that God had given on tablets of stone at Sinai. And now we find that God has made an oath. I don't know exactly when Psalm 110 was written, but it came after the law. God has made an oath, and he says, my son will be high priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. That supersedes it. For the writer of Hebrew, writing to an audience who were familiar with Jewish teaching, again, this would have been one of those things where the ground shakes and the sound effects go off and lets them know, oh, wait a minute, here's something's changed. This is new. This is different. And so then we get to chapter 8, as Dan pointed out last week. The writer says, okay, here's the primary thing. This is the main point. I actually tried to do some research on this, and it's really a term that's used very rarely in the New Testament, and it's not a real clear understanding of exactly what word we would use. It could be translated as summarize, or some of the translations say main point. One just simply says the point is. But the idea is the writer here is kind of summing up everything he's been talking about and wanting to synthesize it into what he wants them to remember. This is the takeaway, if you would, to use our common language. This is the takeaway the writer wants you to understand. We have such a high priest who has taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens. That's what he wants them to see. He doesn't want them to go back to the images they've seen before. Aaron with the turban on his head, as glorious and as beautiful as that was. The temple that was there in Jerusalem that Herod had made into this beautiful building. Don't look at that. Instead, I want you to see your high priest. We have such a high priest who has taken his seat at the majesty of God, and he intercedes for you today. Anybody with thoughts or questions about what we've talked about today? All right, thank you again for your participation. Next week, we're going to get into chapter 8, and I want you to specifically from Jeremiah 31. I want you to think about why Jeremiah is the appropriate prophet for God to give this prophecy through of a new covenant.